and welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 14 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. Hello, gorgeous listener. How are you feeling today? I hope that the answer is awesome, but if it isn't, then thank you for choosing to spend the next chunk of time with me. I hope this episode will distract if that's what you need, and also inspire. I'm pretty sure that it will, because today's episode is the second part of my conversation with pattern drafting and fitting expert Kate Roberts from Project Patterns. The first part of the conversation went out last week, and that went into all sorts of fitting fundamentals, tips and techniques. This episode kind of builds on all of that, so if you haven't heard last week's episode yet, you might want to pop this one on pause and go and listen to that one first. So in this one, Kate tackles some fitting related questions posed by some lovely Check Your Thread patrons. So among other topics, we get into some trouser fitting nitty gritty, which, let's face it, is one of the more confusing aspects of garment sewing. Kate also responds to a fantastic question about how to adapt seemingly gendered sewing patterns for different body shapes and types. So, were you inspired by last week's episode to make garment fitting a bigger part of your making process? I definitely was, although I haven't had much chance to do that on myself yet. Since the last episode, I've made my daughter a peasant-style top from a Tobra Design magazine pattern, and I used a remnant of viscose crepe with stars on it. She doesn't look super impressed with it yet, but I'm hoping that once she puts it on, she'll love it. So what have you been making? Whatever it is, I hope it's been a really fun project. This week, I also brought back my free Pattern Friday blog post series. So that's where I road test and review a free sewing pattern or tutorial, and I publish the post on the first Friday of every month on my Sozo What Do You Know blog. I took about 6 months off from posting that series after several years of consistent posting. But now it's back and I'm so excited to share with you some of the awesome patterns that I've got lined up for the months ahead. This month I tested a laminate wash bag tutorial available on the Polka Dot Chair website. I found the tutorial whilst researching the Travel, Sustainability and Sewing episode, which was number 81 with Shams Eldin Rogers. I was also heavily inspired by previous guest Rachel Kirby, who spoke to me for episode 82. Rachel made all sorts of awesome pouches and cases in advance of her trip to the US to make her life easier. Anyway, this tutorial would be super useful for anyone about to go on any trips, so I'm going to pop the link to that post in the show notes if you'd like to check that out. I don't really have any sustainability wins or fails for you this week because, quite frankly, I've just been trying to keep my SHIT together. I'm just trying to keep on top of all sorts of stuff right now and even get ahead of myself with making this podcast because the school holidays are going to kick in a couple of weeks and I'm going to lose most of my opportunities to work. But I've actually lost a fair bit of time recently as well due to inset days at the school and teachers' strike days as well. So for the record, I am 3,000% in support of the strikes, but losing work time is definitely frustrating. Anyways, I'll stop moaning and instead thank two incredible people, Sue and Kirsty. They signed up to support the podcast via Patreon this week. Thank you so much, you two, for helping keep me caffeinated and covering some of my expenses whilst I plough what time I can into making this podcast. Oh, and I also quickly want to say hi to a lovely listener called Mel. Mel came up to me in a playground in Brighton on Friday to say that they loved the podcast. It really made my day. Thank you, Mel. Right, episode time. I really hope you have fun listening to this one. I had such a great time talking to Kate. She really is a sweetheart and so generous with her knowledge and her time. I'd really like to encourage her to come back on the podcast again in the future. So please head over to her website or her Instagram account, send her a message and tell her that you enjoyed these episodes so that she feels like coming back on Check Your Thread. You can find her links along with all the other stuff and people that we reference in the episode in the show notes, which you'll find in your podcast app and on the website checkyourthread.com. Okay, enjoy! Right, so we have got some questions, haven't we? We posed some questions to the Check Your Thread patrons, and they've come up with some really cool questions, haven't they?
They have. They are great questions.
Right, so let's get cracking. First of all, we got a question from Liz. Liz asks, what and where are the best ways to learn fitting? So buying a book, YouTube, forums, Facebook groups, sewing classes. Liz is saying that she learnt by working in Made to Measure, but when people ask her where they can learn, she doesn't really know what to suggest.
Okay, so this is a really tricky one. So books, like I said, are a great starting point, but you do want to try and make sure you get books that have photographs rather than illustrations. Illustrations can be helpful as well if you can't find a book that has suitable photographs, but personally, I think photographs are more helpful.
Have you seen the Fit for Real People and the Pants Fitting for Real People, those books?
I've seen the Pants Fitting for Real People, actually, and that one is quite good.
Yeah, I think they're more tissue fitting ones, aren't they, those books?
They are, yeah, but they still go through the basic principles. And for me, that's what the books are about. You learn the basic principles of fitting, and you get to look at patterns and garments on a figure. And of course, that figure might not be the same figure that you have, but it's still starting that analytical process in your mind of looking at, okay, this is this garment on this body, and this is how it's fitting, this is how it's hanging. So the books for me would be a good beginning point to kind of build that foundation. But from there, you really want to get into your practical experience. So that's things like videos, courses, experimenting, trial and error. It's really helpful to actually make something for someone else as well, so that you, again, are looking at building that analytical kind of thinking in your mind. Sometimes when you're learning, it's nice to work with someone else's body for a little bit. But there are heaps of fitting videos on YouTube, which are helpful to a certain extent, but be careful about who you decide to learn from. Just kind of look into the teacher, try and have a little dive into like who they are and what their experience is, and be careful of picking the wrong adjustment, I think. But I have some fitting courses, which are kind of drafting and fitting courses, and they're all videos and they go through step by step what to look for, how to pin your garment, and how to adjust your pattern. And you want to look for that kind of process. Obviously, I'm not saying mine are the only ones out there, but just make sure you kind of look for that process rather than just, this is the problem, here's your fix. You want to look for that. This is what we're looking for. This is why we have the problem. This is how we pin our toile, and this is how we adjust the pattern.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So Cole asks, based on my measurements, I sew bottoms, but always end up with a big crotch bubble. Last pair of jeans, I ended up pulling off the waistband and editing 2 inches out of the centre middle. What should I be doing with my patterns before I cut my fabric? So this is going back to trousers being a nightmare. So yeah, what's going on for Cole? Can we give them some help?
Okay, so this is a great question. And this kind of goes back to what you were saying about people getting patterns and expecting them to fit perfectly. And I love that Cole has started by saying, I pick pattern based on my measurements. Measurements are one thing, proportions are another, right? So even if you have the same waist and hip measurement as the pattern is intended to fit, you might find that your length is different to the pattern. So as well as checking those circumference measurements, you also want to check that the length measurements are the same. So if your waist is, let's say 70, and the pattern waist is also 70, you want to make sure that the pattern waist is intended to sit in the natural waist and not a little bit lower, because if it's then 70 and actually it's supposed to sit on your kind of top hip area, your top hip area is going to be bigger than 70. So you want to check that the proportions lengthwise as well as circumference wise are the same for your body. And then for trousers, it is super, super tricky, particularly this front area through the front rise. And I'm assuming that they mean they've adjusted the waist kind of area down to the hip through that like top to middle part of the rise.
They've said, I ended up pulling off the waistband and editing 2 inches out of the centre middle. So my interpretation is they've kind of pinched
off the centre front.
Yeah, that's my interpretation of that, to remove a bubble.
Yeah. So for me, that would be a proportion problem. So ideally, before you cut into your fabric, you check your measurements, of course, your proportions to check that your length and everything is right. And then you adjust your pattern before you cut into your fabric. So taking 2 inches off the center front can have some negative effects as well. Ideally, you would take that 2 inches off the side seam so that you don't upset the balance of your trouser.
Yeah, because the back will then be bigger than the front in proportion if you're...
Yeah, and then your front rise ends up being very angled, which in some cases we do need quite an angled centre front, but generally your front rise tends to be fairly straight, maybe just like a centimetre or so angled. But if you're then taking 2 inches, you're angling that quite a lot, which then changes the shaping in your pattern because we have shaping in that rise now. So then that can make your front trouser bulge a little bit as well. So ideally you take that 2 inches off the side seam. So for me, going back to the question, like, what do I do before I cut into my fabric? Check your measurements, check your proportions, and check your shaping, and then adjust your pattern, and then cut into your fabric. And always make a toile.
Yes, so make a toile, first point, and then check for those things, yeah, and try taking it out of the side seams, evenly the front and the back.
Yes. If it's a circumference issue like that, for sure, you want to maintain the balance of the garment. So you still want it to hang correctly. So if you're changing the circumference measurements of the waist, you want to take it at your side seams rather than your centre front and centre back. There are other things that you can do at your centre front and centre back, but they wouldn't affect the circumference, they would affect the shaping.
So then if there's still some bubble, maybe lower down the front rise, there's some other adjustments that can be more suitable for sorting that out. I'm wondering as well if there's a big bubble, maybe the rise is too long possibly as well, if there's too much fullness there, you know. I mean, it's possible to say without seeing, but...
Yeah, agreed. A bubble at the front rise can be created by multiple different things, and it depends where the bubble is sitting. So if it's in that like much lower section of the rise, chances are it's more of a rise width problem. So you want to add, at the crotch point, you want to add more width, like through the thigh area, or take away through the thigh area at that crotch point. If it's kind of through the top area and it's sort of the bubble is then like going down your leg as well, then it's probably a rise height issue. Like you said, you want to actually reduce the rise height a little bit, do like a flat tummy adjustment almost. And of course, you know, the rise curve makes a huge difference here as well. If you have too much shaping in your curve, you're going to get a bubble. If you have too little, it's going to be super, super tight.
Right. Okay, well, hopefully that's some pointers for Cole to check out with their next trouser project. Okay, we've got a couple of questions from Kim. Let's go for this one first. So when making alterations, what are the things I need to think about? What are the common dependencies between two things? What pieces affect other pieces? It sounds like Kim's trying to just understand everything. And I know Kim, and I think that's true. Because what I found about every time I go to make an adjustment, and then I don't realise that it impacts a different pattern piece. Like, what are some common pitfalls? It's a lot in that, sorry.
So one, Kim has already mentioned, so when you adjust one pattern, any piece that stitches to that also is probably going to need adjusting. So if we lower the front armhole, we're also going to need to lower the back armhole because that changes the length of our side seam. If we do something like changing the shoulder position of our sleeve, if we make our shoulder narrower, then we also need to make our sleeve higher to match that new higher shoulder.
So think about what's going to stitch to that edge.
Precisely, yeah. And this is where actually the tissue fitting actually can be really helpful because you're sort of pinning your garment together in paper form before you cut it out in fabric. So then it's really easy to spot things like that. You know, if you have a skirt and you've made your skirt smaller at the waist and the hip, but you haven't adjusted your waistband, then when you pin your pattern together or your tissue paper together and then you try to pin your waistband on that, it's not going to fit. So you're immediately going to know that something needs fixing there. Yeah. So that's kind of where the tissue paper fitting can be really helpful.
I wonder if the tissue paper would almost even be more helpful in the fabric, because sometimes with fabric there is a tendency just to ease it in, isn't it? Oh, I probably cut that wrong and I'm going to ease that in. But with paper doesn't lie.
Paper does not lie. You can't just trim a bit of paper off and be like, it was never there.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. So that's a really good tip. Yeah, think about what that is going to attach to, and then think, does that also need to be changed in some way?
Yeah. And then on the back of that, often people don't check and true their patterns, which again goes back to that putting your pieces together, that stitched together, to make sure that they are the same length, that they have a nice run when they stitch together, that the curve is still beautiful, and those kinds of things. That's often a step that gets skipped, and it's definitely one that's super important, and I would highly recommend after every single adjustment that you check and true your pattern. And something else is adjusting things like lengths. And this probably sounds silly, but so if you're making let's say like a mini dress, for example, and you're changing your waist position because maybe you have a short body, but you have long legs, but the pattern is drafted for someone with a long body and short legs. So you want to move your waist seam. Often what can happen is people will just adjust the bodice. So they'll just raise the waist seam up on the bodice, but leave the skirt the length it is. If you're making a mini dress, what's going to happen is your entire dress gets much, much shorter, and it's all going to be out in the open. Knickers everywhere. So remember to think about your total length of your garment when you're adjusting lengths and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah, if you're taking things out, you may need to add it back somewhere else, unless you are a shorter person, and that's the effect that you were going for. Yeah. Awesome.
I have one more actually on that.
Oh, please, please.
Is a really good thing to always double check on your patterns. If you're changing your outer, remember to change your lining and your facings as well.
Such a good point.
Something that often gets forgotten, but always has to be done.
Such a good point. It's brilliant. Okay, Kim's also said, when making up patterns, she's noticed that there's a consistent problem. Yes. So I know about this because Kim also posed this question to the garment alteration expert I had on recently. So she was talking about how she can change existing garments, but now Kim's going back to the pattern. So Kim says, when making up sewing patterns, she's noticed a consistent problem with the crotch of her trousers. The front part, the rise part, is always a little bit baggy and too long, and the back is always a little bit snug. So I think that means that my front is a little bit flatter and my bum is a little bit bigger, which is a nice problem to have, she says, but not so great when making things. What should I be thinking about here? This seems to be happening every time they make a pair of trousers. I know she's been making the closet core Pietra pants recently, so if you needed a visual of what kind of trousers she's talking about.
Okay, I love this question because it goes back to that whole, you might have the right measurement, but it might be distributed slightly wrong. So
absolutely,
even if you can get these trousers on, the front is baggy and the back is tight, the total rise length, so your trouser rise, might fit on your body, but it's totally distributed in the wrong places. So it sounds like we might need to do a bit of a flat tummy adjustment, so reducing the length in our front rise, but then adding that same amount back into the back rise, so doing like a full seat adjustment on the back.
So is that slashing through horizontally and then was making like a hinge at the side seam and expanding it a little bit, like hinging it up a little bit?
Precisely, yeah. And I don't like to use pattern adjustment names like flat seat and full seat, because I think it immediately puts an idea of what a body should be in people's minds. So really what we're doing with that kind of adjustment is we're adding height into our rise, right? Yeah. So when we take that slash line and we draw from our center back rise to our side seam, the hinge is at the side seam and we open up the center back to add height in there. And that makes our center back rise seam longer. And that gives us extra fabric to then fit around the body. And when we do the opposite on the front, we cut into the center front rise and we cut to the side seam and we hinge at the side seam and we close that center front slightly.
Right, so you're kind of overlapping it a little bit.
Exactly. And we're reducing the length in that front rise. And of course, you want to test this on your garment. Try pinning it out. You will find that if you do this higher up on your hip, it's very different to if you do it lower down on your hips. So make sure you're taking it in the right place.
How will you know where it's the right place?
By pinning it and then assessing it.
Right. So seeing if anything else goes weird.
Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, it will depend on the body. Someone who has a tummy is going to need a trouser that fits slightly differently to someone who doesn't really have a tummy. So that will dictate where you take that volume from. And on the back as well, you can test that on your garment. You can cut into your toile and pin fabric in. And again, doing that in different places will give you different effects. But that's what I would do in this scenario. I would take length out of the front and I would add it in at the back. And you might find that you want to do that at the crotch point as well, so that you increase and decrease the width of your trouser as well as the height. But again, just that experimentation process will really, really help.
Yes, I can totally see that. Okay, last question. I love this one so much. Clayton has said, "Hi Zoe, I'd be interested to know whether Kate has any suggestions in altering patterns that might typically be considered female for a male presenting body. I fit into the latter category, yet am drawn to sewing things that have a more gender fluid design. Think flowy, draped, oversized, relaxed fit. But my brain has a very hard time conceptualizing making and wearing something once it's deemed a woman's quote-unquote pattern. I'm new to this, but in my search so far, it's rare to find things that resonate with me in the quote-unquote men's section. It's usually a pair of joggers and a pair of pyjama pants, maybe a button-down shirt. I know exactly what Clayton's talking about. In instances where companies deem a pattern unisex, the models are often female presenting, which I guess is probably because they're the people that generally are buying the pattern more often, I'm guessing. So it's difficult for me to see myself in the design. And Clayton suggested we check out _Donny Q on Instagram, and I did, and they are amazing. They are somebody that Clayton feels it succeeds in doing what I'm trying to do, but I don't really understand how he does it. I know he drafts a lot of his own patterns, which I feel is very beyond me right now, though often the only way I might be able to achieve what I'm hoping for. This is such an interesting question, isn't it?
I love this question. I've been thinking about this a lot actually since you sent it to me and trying to like puzzle it through in my mind. So for me, there's two things here. There's the visualization of someone else's design on their body. And then there's the technical process of, well, how do I achieve that?
Right.
So for me, the visualization is such an important part of this, because when you're making patterns or sewing garments, kind of need to know what direction you're going in. You need to have a creative vision. And if you're feeling a little bit lost there because someone else has put an idea in your mind, that's really difficult, and you kind of might feel like you're swimming somewhere but like aimlessly. So something that is really helpful in this situation is to start drawing. And I know not everyone loves to draw, so there are other things you can do, but kind of take that design process away from someone else and bring it into your own world. And maybe draw that design on your body. Find a template that works for you, that better represents your body, and start doodling and thinking, well, I love that design, but actually it needs a wider shoulder to fit my body, or I need to drop the waist, or I need to do these things. So start doodling so that you can get a really clear, creative vision for yourself.
That's such a good idea.
That's like step one for me.
I'm wondering if there's a way that you could make those croquis for yourself, you know, where maybe you take a photo of yourself in a really neutral position and then somehow make an outline that you can then repeat and use your own physique as a basis, you know?
Yeah, like a template almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, there must be...
There's got to be a program for that.
Yeah, and I know that there are digital platforms where you can do like digital garments as well. So Dressed is one of them, where you can create digital garments, different types of bodies.
Right.
And this idea of like digital clothing in like the fashion tech world is quite big, but I think they're pretty difficult to use.
Right.
But it might be a fun thing to try and learn if hand drawing or things like that, or maybe not, you know, your thing.
Yeah, if you're more of a tech person or an analog, yeah, you can have a play around.
Yeah. Yeah. So that would be step one for me, kind of find a way to have a creative vision that works for you. Because I understand it's really difficult to look at something on a different body type and then translate that through into your own mind. So step two then is the technical thing. Like, how do you then take that idea, that garment, that pattern, and translate it into what works for your body? And here we have this technical menswear versus women's wear dilemma, because most patterns start with a block, right? And a block is a template. It's a very basic pattern that is proportioned for the body that we're trying to create patterns for. And a menswear block, basic menswear block, is very different to a basic women's wear block. Mainly, the shoulder width is different. So a menswear block is much wider than a women's wear block. We will also find that, of course, the circumference measurements are different, but also the position of things are different. So on a men's wear block, the waist is much lower down than a women's wear block.
Right.
And of course, it's bigger. Then we have things like the shaping. So things like darts and stuff, so bust darts specifically, are a big feature on a women's wear block, which are not a big feature on a men's wear block. So there are a couple of things that are significantly different in the proportions of the block that would have been used to create any kind of pattern, really. So picking a pattern that you can easily convert from women's wear to men's wear is tricky. So starting with a unisex pattern is a really, really great idea. But again, there aren't that many feminine twist unisex patterns. They do tend to be more like oversized menswear type ones. But saying that, you can take a creative women's wear pattern and convert it into a menswear one. It's a lot of trial and error, but for me, I would think first about the shoulder width, the body width, the length proportion, so position of waist, position of hips, and then the shaping.
That's kind of exactly the order that you were saying before about when assessing the fit of a garment.
Yeah, it always kind of goes back to that, right? Because that's how our garments fit the body. But try to pick a simple pattern to start with. Like we were saying, you don't pick a trouser as the first thing you learn to fit. I would suggest picking a simple shape to start this process with. Good point about it being easier to draft your own patterns.
I was going to say, do you think it might be worth Clayton making their own blocks specific to their measurements to start off with?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly where I was kind of thinking about going, because every pattern starts with the block. So if you can get your own block, get it to fit really nicely, then you can take that women's wear pattern and you can lay it over your block to see how you can change those positions and those circumference measurements and the shoulder positions as well.
Yeah.
If you're going to do that, you also then might as well start learning to draft your own patterns, because it's only a short step from doing that to drafting your own patterns.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So Clayton was feeling like that was like a big thing that they weren't necessarily ready to take on. But maybe it's not such a big thing. Maybe it isn't as much as Clayton's building it up to feel.
Yeah, it really isn't. And I think pattern cutting feels like this big beast, and it's really mathematical and it's really scary. And it's really not. It's so creative and it's so fun. You just need to learn some basic techniques like dart rotation. You need to really tap into that analytical thinking in your brain to really assess things. But once you master the basics, it honestly opens up an entire world of possibilities. And particularly for Clayton, who's having this quite specific body proportion problem, that's all pattern cutting. You can create anything you want to fit any type of body, and it should fit perfectly, it should function perfectly, and it should express your own personal style.
And I guess in a way that going through that step now, whether you choose to do something online or go to an in-person class, getting those skills now will probably save time and energy in the longer run. But if you're already starting with something that is really good right now, rather than every pattern you discover that you would like to try and make, if it's a quote-unquote woman's pattern, having to translate that into to a more men's pattern proportions and then making tweaks. If you've already got yourself in block form, you're skipping some of those steps each time you want to make a new creation.
For sure. The hardest part is getting a block that fits you well. Once you've got a block, it's honestly smooth sailing from there. The idea with the block is it fits you perfectly. So you make small little changes to it and your garment should fit you perfectly as well. I understand a lot of people don't want to draft their own blocks because it is a little bit mathematical and it can be a little bit daunting. So there are places that you can buy blocks as well, and then you can make little tweaks and get those to fit you. And that's something I would definitely recommend if Clayton's feeling a little overwhelmed with the whole pattern cutting side of things.
Yeah.
Buy a block that does fit you and you are happy with, and then you can start experimenting with that. Yeah. And the idea of taking your block and the pattern you're trying to convert and laying them over each other is a really great one as well. It will help you to understand the proportions and the differences there, and it will also help with that visualization.
Yeah. So what should Clayton be thinking about in terms of like ease, like design ease and wearing ease?
It depends on the garment again.
Sure.
I would have a look at the first pattern, so the women's wear in inverted commas pattern, and try and work out how much ease is in there, because you always get body measurements with your pattern, right?
Good point. Yeah, you can literally figure it out.
Exactly. And you can see how much ease is in there, and it's always a rough figure. You could go 2 or 3 centimeters up and it probably won't make that much difference. Down, different, but you can definitely add a bit extra in there and it's very good. But try and use that as a ballpark figure to see how much ease you need in there.
Yeah, so literally find out what the bust measurement of the pattern, you could like literally measure the pattern if they don't have finished measurements, and then compare that to the size chart that's printed on the pattern, and find out, okay, well, there's like 10 centimeters ease around the chest in this. And so when I'm translating to that, I need to make sure that there's about that if I want to create the same look or compared to my own chest measurement.
Yeah, for sure. And it's often easier to pick a bigger size and work with the extra volume that you can then pin out, rather than picking a smaller size and adding in.
Okay.
So, for example, if I was taking like a vest top, maybe a woven vest top with some darts in it, no sleeves, just normal armholes and a standard neckline. If I was taking that and wanted to convert that shape into more of a masculine shape, I would think about those shoulder points and I would think about those darts. Length doesn't really matter because there's no waist seam or anything. I would think about maybe shifting my waist curve, my side seam curve a little bit down, but that's simple. We can deal with that later on. That's a smaller problem. The bigger problem would be my shoulders and my darts. So then I would think, okay, well, if I'm trying to make my shoulders wider, then it makes sense to actually pick a bigger size that has a wider shoulder because our shoulder's grade.
Yeah.
So I take the bigger size, and then if I need to then make them even wider, I can do that adjustment. Those darts are going to be a little bit wider because it's a bigger size, but really I'm probably going to slash those darts out and get rid of them completely, so it doesn't really matter. Then if you fit that and you think, I've got a bit too much fabric in here, it's so much easier to pin fabric out than it is to cut in and add fabric.
Right,
it's so fiddly to pin bits of fabric in there, but pinning fabric out is much easier. So almost go the other way. Be extra cautious, add extra ease or width or length in there. You can always pin it out.
Brilliant. Have you ever used the Winifred Aldrich books?
Yes, actually all the drafting methods that I teach are based on the Winifred. I've tweaked them slightly and changed a few things, but they come from those books originally.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it'd be worth Clayton, because you can get them super cheap on like secondhand bookshop sites, can't you? I wonder if it would be worth Clayton getting the one designed for menswear and using that, because I've drafted basic blocks using some of those proportions just as a starting point. That might be a good ease in.
Yeah, for sure. That would be a great way to start. And there are different types of blocks as well. You could even potentially take the women's wear book and do a loose fitting women's wear one without a dart, and then do a fitted men's wear one and kind of merge them together a little bit or put them on top of each other to really see like what are the key differences in here. And that will sort of help Clayton to again analyze those patterns if they're taking the women's wear pattern and trying to convert it over into men's wear ones.
Yeah. Also, I'm very excited for Clayton's journey.
Me too. I would love to hear more about how this journey goes, Clayton. Please get in touch with me and let me know like how this all goes, because this is, I've been thinking about this question a lot over the last week.
And I feel like it's something that is only going to expand. I think there's going to be a lot more experimentation and developments in this area, don't you think? In both in commercial garments and in hopefully then in indie sewn patterns as well.
Yeah, for sure. And it's something that we're seeing in the fashion industry as well. This very segregated world of menswear and women's wear actually doesn't meet our needs anymore as consumers. So it's something I'm really interested in how we reframe all of that to actually meet our modern day needs. And it doesn't just happen between menswear and women's wear. It's happening between sort of standard sizing and sort of plus sizing as well. Those different brackets. We're kind of going from this very linear way of thinking to this much more inclusive, round way of thinking. And it's really exciting.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your help. So where can people find you?
Okay, so a couple of places. Like I said, I'm very active on Instagram. I'm at Project Patterns. Send me a DM, say hello. You can also find me on my website, www.project-patterns.co.uk. That's where you'll find all of my online courses. Again, drop me an email if you have any questions. I'm always around for that. And you can also find me on YouTube. I'm at Project Patterns.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. We've gone way over the hour, so I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everyone for sending in your questions. They were really great.
So good. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!